I'm sure all of you guys have seen someone try to claim that Crash Bandicoot is extremely hard before at some point in your lives, but I've actually seen some website articles claim that Crash Bandicoot is the Dark Souls of platforming games, which I want to say is ridiculous, but actually I haven't ever beaten the game before. So in today's video, I'm going to 100% complete the original Crash Bandicoot game and hyper-analyze how hard it is, because that's what you guys want to see, right? So in this video, I'm going to be playing the remake because, come on, just the scaling issues alone for the original game would be a nightmare for editing. But when I was a little kid, I actually did play the original for a little bit. There was a local church building thing that had a PS1 inside with Crash Bandicoot that was really fun, until somebody stole it. From a church. But there was a Steam sale recently, which I was lucky enough to be able to finally get the remastered N Sane trilogy, and while I haven't ever been able to beat the original, I think now is probably the best time, right? Since there's a fourth one apparently. So one thing I want to get out of the way before anything else is that I love Crash Bandicoot. I loved it as a kid and I love playing it now in the remastered version. So when I start critiquing the levels, I just want you guys to know that I love this game as a whole, and I actually want Crash as my #1 most wanted character for Smash Ultimate DLC, so Nintendo, come on, you know you want to. One of the cool things about Crash Bandicoot, unlike his competitors Mario and Sonic, is that there are not separate worlds that you go through to progress, it's just one big adventure. And as the landscape changes on the overworld, the levels change fitting it, which is really cool, especially for a PlayStation 1 game. Also, in case you were unaware, the physics in Crash Bandicoot World are very similar to Mario's. 100 peaches gives you an extra life, how 100 coins in Mario gives you a 1-up. Crash can get the Aku Aku masks from these boxes, which as a kid I actually thought looked a lot cooler than Mario's power-ups, but that's probably just because Aku Aku is colorful. If you get a second Aku Aku, you just get an additional hit just like the first one. So it's like the upgrades from Super Mario World minus the extra ability like shooting fireballs or flying. Except also, if you get a third Aku Aku mask, it works like an invincibility star from Mario, making you run faster and kill enemies when you touch them. In addition to being able to jump on enemies, Crash Bandicoot can also whip out a spin move to kill enemies, which again, I also thought was cooler than Mario as a kid. And Super Mario World was, and still is, one of my favorite games of all time, which is saying something. But some more things that are unique to Crash Bandicoot are the gems and, onks you get from each of the levels. These things you get in each level by retrying it after you've already beaten it, and once you do that, there will be a little clock thing you can run into which lets you speedrun the level. There are 3 versions of these things, with Platinum being the best one, which is awarded to you if you get the fastest time. The way you get gems from the levels though is surprisingly hard. You have to not only break every single box in the level, including all the TNT boxes, but you also have to do it without dying a single time, and only then will you get the gem. There are also different types of gems in specific levels where you do the same thing, but instead of it being a regular gem, it's a special one that opens up more paths than previous levels, letting you get all the boxes when you couldn't before. So based off of all that, you should be able to tell that Crash Bandicoot is actually really fun and unique just based off the replayability things alone. But I want to argue that even the game design and level design is extremely well done also. Well, most of the time. Before I get straight into the level design, I want to talk about how good the game looks real quick in the remastered one. When I played the PS1 version as a kid, I honestly thought that it looked really cool to the point where once I got a GameCube, I asked for this specific Crash Bandicoot game, which I eventually got and really enjoyed. But in the remastered version, the game looks incredible. I'm playing this on Steam, so maybe that's cheating, but the lighting, the textures, and even the animations are all insanely good looking. You can tell there are definitely some reused assets, but they all look good, so it isn't a problem at all, and it makes dying over and over in the same spots much more tolerable. But back to talking about the level design. In the beginning, the levels are obviously really easy, but I also think they're really fun. A lot of times when random companies try to make platformer mascots that aren't Mario, they end up making their levels extremely boring or way too hard. And Crash Bandicoot never has this problem at any point in the game. Both the hardest and easiest levels are really fun to play. Well, at least without worrying about getting all the gems, but I'll get to that later. On top of the speedrun replayability already making these levels a lot more fun, the levels also have multiple paths you can choose from, meaning that when you go back to do a 100% run of the game, you have to go through both paths in order to get all the boxes, which I actually think is really cool. But another thing that makes Crash Bandicoot really cool and unique, on top of everything I just said, is the fact that you can sling enemies into each other and into boxes by spinning into them. This doesn't seem like it would be that important, and it's really not that important to pay attention to, but it certainly is really fun. It's actually a lot more complex than you think it would be too. Spinning enemies into more enemies is always really cool and comes in handy a lot when you're going back to speedrun the levels. But slinging enemies around can also be a bad thing too, which is why I think it's such a cool mechanic. There are several spots in levels where there's an extra life box or some other really important box that you want to get somewhere in the level with enemies, and sometimes if you spin into them just wrong, they can fling away all the goodies that you wanted to have. Which you can also do yourself on accident, by the way. I don't know why the game lets you spin away the extra life drops you find, but honestly it's kind of funny, so I don't mind. The level design is also changed up a lot as the game goes on, which is nice. The first few levels are this third-person perspective, which works really nicely and is of course really fun to play. But there are also some levels that force the camera into a 2D perspective, and these sections are always some of my favorites to play, but maybe that's because I've spent 90% of my life playing Mega Man. Sometimes there can be platforming areas where the camera angles makes it really hard to see where you're going, and which makes the jumps almost impossible, but I'll talk about that later also. Some of the most fun levels, to me at least, are the boulder chasing levels and the vehicle levels where you ride pigs. Normally auto-scrollers and platformer games are done really poorly unless your name is Mega Man, Mario, or Sonic. But Crash Bandicoot's solution to this actually makes auto-scrolling more fun with its level design, which is a big accomplishment to speedrunners and gamers worldwide. The way Crash does this is different in the boulder levels and the pig levels. In the boulder levels, the auto-scrolling turns itself into the obstacle because you're running away from a giant boulder Indiana Jones style, which makes all of the platforming more intense with death looking you over the shoulder. In the pig levels, this is pretty much done the same way actually, just backwards. You hop on the pig and the auto-scroll is really fast, which turns the auto-scrolling itself into the challenge again, but this time you just gotta keep up with the pace of your pig. I personally really enjoy all the levels like this, but I've heard the opposite of some people, so I guess that's what happens whenever you have an opinion, huh? So yeah, the level design is really well done in the original Crash Bandicoot, which brings us back to our original question. Is Crash Bandicoot actually as hard as everyone says it is? While obviously there are going to be hard parts in Crash Bandicoot, just like there are hard parts in any video game, I feel like they're justified and fair for the most part. Going through the levels, there were several really challenging enemy and platforming areas, but none of them really seemed unfair, and I was usually able to beat them within a few attempts. But there are a few parts of the game that are hard for reasons that I think were outside of the level designer's intentions. For example, this spot where I died the most in the entire game was right here, on what should be easy jumps, but just aren't because I can't see anything. I don't know if I'm the only one with this problem, but depth perception in video games is something that's hard enough to keep track of even in the most well-done games like Mario Odyssey. But sometimes the jumps in Crash just feel wrong. Like in this level, there are so many jumps where you just can't see where you should be at all. I've been showing a bunch of the deaths on screen, and this is probably where I got frustrated the most in the entire game. But the reason I was getting frustrated wasn't just because it was hard, but like I didn't know how to stop dying in the exact same spot because judging where Crash is in the air is almost impossible to do. All of the areas in the game that are intended to be really hard are certainly hard, but they are all doable and fair. I just personally get frustrated when the challenge comes from something the developers didn't intend to be challenging, like simple jumps causing me 5 game overs in a row. But apart from that, the difficulty was definitely reasonable. I'm not talking about 100%ing the game yet because I'll get to that last, but in terms of just beating every level, it's really not that bad. And the levels that are really hard are still fairly easy to get through just because they're fun enough to encourage you to keep trying. I know in the original the saving situation was much worse, but in the remakes the amount of saves and checkpoints in the game is pretty much perfect if you ask me. Also, every single boss in the game is really easy. The first boss is just boom boom from Mario 3, it's 3 jumps and you win. The kangaroo boss is fairly easy, you just gotta do some timing stuff. This ripped rat dude is really easy once you realize you have to throw rocks back at him. Wait, he's a koala? After him, you have to go against this gangsta, who is certainly a rat and he wields a Tommy gun, but unfortunately, he's also easy. Dr. Nitrous was hard for me at first because I didn't know what to do once he turned into the Hulk because his hitbox is weird, but once I realized that you had to jump on his head, this was an easy dub. Dr. Cortex is also fairly easy. He's certainly harder than the rest of the bosses, but he isn't a challenge at all, especially compared to some of the other levels in the game. So yeah, after just beating the game and beating all the levels, I really don't understand what people are complaining about unless they also had that very specific depth perception complaint that I had. But the real challenge comes from 100% completing the game, so we're gonna do that right now. We are. Well, before I get into the details of 100%ing the game, is it worth it? What do you get for it? Well, nothing. You get some achievements, I guess, and I think you also get to skip the Cortex boss fight, but I did that first, so I wouldn't know. Either way, luckily for you guys, I have OCD, so I had to do it anyway, and yeah, it is hard. The speedruns actually do not count towards the percent completion, surprisingly, but I also still got all the platinums because it seemed like the right thing to do. Obviously, getting all the gems is a really hard task, considering you have to break every box in every level without dying. Well, without dying in the attempt. You can die in between getting the gems, of course. But you know what? I think that it should be as hard as it is. Yeah, it's dumb how hard it is, but this game is built on replayability. And if you're already able to beat the game, then clearly it isn't too hard. I personally think when it comes to getting extra things like 100% completion, especially once the game's already beaten, that it's totally justified for it to be stupidly hard. That's the point of it. You already beat the game, so clearly it wasn't too much of a challenge, which is why there is more challenging things added for the completionists and super fans of the game. If this is what people are talking about when they say Crash Bandicoot is too hard, then they're crackheads, because, like, everything I just said? Welp, it turns out the answer to this question is no, it's actually not as hard as everyone says it is. Obviously the game is hard, just not to the extent that people claim. Well, at least not the first Crash Bandicoot game. I'm in town.